All right, welcome to Researching Happy. My name is Matt Aistiello, and this is the podcast all about the research world of happiness and well-being. Today's guest is a bit of an inspiration to many, to me for sure, Professor Lindsay Oades from the University of Melbourne. Talking about this idea of well-being literacy, by and large. I mean, we cover a bunch of stuff, but this idea of well-being literacy, thinking of well-being as a language, as Lindsay puts it, as a foreign language to most, it puts a real spin on how I think we've talked about well-being so far on the show. Listen out, I guess, for some of the things that have been like probably the two most recurring themes of the show so far. This idea of use of language when it comes to mental health and well-being, but also the power of multidisciplinary research teams. And I think that's really actually at the heart of a lot of what we talk about today. So enjoy. Let me know what you think. Do me a favor. I made a big mistake, or it's a minor mistake, I guess, but a stupid mistake. I just basically stopped uploading stuff to YouTube. I was kind of sick of sort of splitting views between Spotify and YouTube, but that's really completely irrelevant. So episodes are back on YouTube. Do me a massive favor and subscribe to YouTube, and share some of those, because there's about 6 episodes that are looking pretty sad there with no views. So do me a favor there if you don't mind. Where I'm about 1 week away from flying to Canada to be at the IPA conference. So I've got about 4 different presentations that I'm involved in. If you're around, reach out, say hi, and otherwise enjoy the episode. Thanks. All right, this is Researching Happy, and we have with us today Professor Lindsay Oades. So just a quick bit of background. Lindsay is Dr. or Professor Lindsay Oades is an internationally acclaimed wellbeing scientist, researcher and educator, and author. He is Deputy Dean of the Melbourne Graduate School of Education and Professor of Wellbeing Science. So welcome, Lindsay.
Thanks, Matt. It's great to be here. Have a bit of fun with you today.
Yeah, appreciate it. Now, most importantly, as far as I'm concerned, on top of that brief bio, is that you're the first Adelaide-born, other than me, Adelaide-born guest on the show. So obviously you're coming to us from Melbourne, but I'm pretty pleased with that.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, no, it's good. People forget the benefits of Adelaide and the many things it's achieved. So hopefully, I know Rupert Murdoch was one of its exports, I think. So I'm not sure if that's a good promotion for me, but yeah, no, it's nice to have the Adelaide connection.
Very cool. My friend actually wrote a book on his relationship to Adelaide, just as a side note and a plug. Very good. So, I mean, I'm not going to be able to talk about anything else unless I've asked these questions. Let's just get this out of the way. So you've just come back from Italy. I mean, I watch you on social media. You've been to India, the US, Italy. It feels like it's been in the last month or something. Tell me what were you doing over there?
So Italy, I was invited by Humanity 2.0, which is a non-government organisation, to attend the Pontificia University to comment on the human flourishing framework that they are developing. And that particularly, apart from being extremely beautiful in Roma, the work of Thomas Aquinas, and so I was working with Father Ezra and another group of invited people to comment on the human flourishing framework and Aquinas's view of what that might be, truth, beauty, kindness, and also that interfacing with Aristotle's views of human flourishing. So it was really they're trying to develop a framework, and so several of us were invited to come and critique, comment, add to, toss around ideas around that framework of human flourishing. And for me that was really, really good, because I have a very secular background, so a lot of the learning with the theologians about their view of human flourishing was kind of cool, actually. It was quite a nice experience, and we get to go back in November to present aspects of the Human Flourishing Framework to businesses and policymakers. So that's the kind of next phase of how to communicate the idea.
Fantastic.
Out of it, yeah.
Yeah, great. And what do you think it was about yourself that warranted the invite?
Because I'm from Adelaide? No. No. I think really just obviously I've had an involvement in wellbeing research for quite a long time, and have commented on that and models thereof. Recently been working on thrivability theory, which is not formally published yet, but is out there for discussion, and people are being interested in that. So I think that, and just people who are aware of the work we've done at the University of Melbourne, probably.
Yeah, I didn't mean that to come across in like a, how the hell did you get an invite? More of a just share your expertise. That's cool, and we're about to have Professor Jennifer Frey on the show. I don't know if you've heard of her work, but she's written specifically on that topic. So hopefully she was invited in some of those discussions as well. I'm sure that she was. Very cool. So, and this is just another thing that's popped into my mind is that in our previous episode now with Dr. Brendan Case, he basically, I think the theme of our discourse there was really about this idea that positive psychology, kind of at its worst, is when it's naive to this rich discourse that's happened in philosophy and theology over these many sort of centuries. Any comments on that, like in relation to your experiences?
Yeah, I think, probably the comments are coming fast in my head. I guess there's a critique of psychology in general about it being too individual or focused, but it's kind of it's a hard critique because that every discipline has a boundary, and so. But I think maybe one of the critiques of positive psychology is if it's a naive agentic approach, that is, that an individual has will and can do everything and the environment doesn't matter. If that was positive psychology, then it deserves to be critiqued. But of course you have, as you know, different versions of what, the different versions of the waves of positive psychology, which we've also written a paper on. Tim Lomas and other authors, we wrote about the third wave positive psychology, which was more about complexity and embracing multiple cultures. The first wave was more standard positive psychology. The second wave was being more admitting that the negative aspects of our experiences are relevant. And it's interesting because in many ways those ideas were there, they were just not the ideas that were promoted. But that's normal scholarship. Whatever you do, someone will critique it. That is how the market of ideas works. So I don't mind that. Yeah, no,
absolutely. And I think there's even another layer to that, isn't it? It's like there's what the author said when they published it, how that was understood when it was read, then how that was almost translated, whether it be by getting picked up in the media or sound bites or tweets or whatever it might be. So there's all these layers of almost misinformation from that original source. And
I guess how it was misunderstood is probably the way I'd put it. It's sort of what happens to it when it gets released, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's got this kind of hollow normative idea behind it that people think it means that we should be happy. And that's pretty well known amongst the scholarly community that's how it's perceived. But it sometimes these things, they get a life that you can never get back, and so it's perceived that way, and that's what it is. And that's how it's branded. So,
yeah, absolutely. And we're working on a project in Tasmania actually, which is around wellbeing literacy. We'll get into a bit of literacy in a moment because that's obviously where you're leading. But someone made a comment yesterday in a bit of a brainstorming conversation of like, we're not going to talk about the idea of wellbeing specifically because it is so misunderstood. And they kind of said, well, let's just use it's basically like we all understand it in a way to be happiness. We know that happiness isn't just about feeling good, but I kind of don't have another better word, is what they said. So let's just leave it at happy for now, and we'll think of something better as we go along. And so that was almost the problem there, isn't it? Is that happy is like 90% of the way there as a term.
Yeah, well, I mean, happy is an interesting one. I mean, I sometimes say that saying happiness to a wellbeing scientist is like saying bug to an entomologist. It's sort of this general term.
Yeah.
And then if it's science, there's going to be more, or certainly an analytical science, is going to be break it into bits, and there's going to be more specific terms, which is totally appropriate for a science. I don't particularly gravitate to the word happiness, and the etymology of happiness is almost interesting. It's sort of like a happenstance or a fortunate, lucky outcome kind of thing. It's almost like a lottery that you got a good lot in life, which of course is many people's experiences. Some people did get a good lot and some people didn't, but I don't think that conceptually is the greatest basis for what we need to do. I think, we need to look at positive emotions and pleasant things and pleasant experiences and aspects of what the hedonic people would want us to look at. No problem with that, as long as we call it what it is. I think happy is a popular term. People will keep using it. But I think for a more rigorous view, it doesn't help us that much. And I'm just upset about 50 or 100 or 1,000 people that have got happy in the books and their products and whatever. But I'm talking at a conceptual rigor.
I'm with you. And this podcast then needs a bit of a name change pretty quickly.
Yeah, exactly. So that's my point. I don't particularly like it for those reasons.
Yep.
It doesn't add clarity. In similar ways, well-being, they're both general terms, but there's problems with every term.
Exactly. To be honest, I think I chose happiness for that reason, that it is ambiguous. But that's cool. So taking a step back, thinking about like just yourself. So you took this is my interpretation basically of your CV, but you began with a classical, career in psychology, becoming a clinical psychologist and working. Did you ever work in practice, or were you always an academic?
No, I did work in practice for a while. It wasn't that long, but I did practice, particularly in public mental health contexts. So I had a classical in an Australian sense. Clinical psychology is the main applied area in this country, because probably we don't have the population to take in so many sub-disciplines that maybe like the US may do. I did clinical psychology. I also did, in my undergraduate, I did philosophy as well, which may not come as a surprise to some people who work with me.
It shows through.
But I also did a bunch of health science related units, so physiology and public health actually.
Oh, that's funny. My undergrad was actually in health science, and it was like my major was basically anatomy and public health. It's completely different place, but I think transferable skills. With so then obviously you were. I'd love to hear how you were sort of exposed to this idea of positive psychology, and then you've obviously made a bit of a jump. I don't know if you see it that way, like you've jumped to that side, to the positive psychology space, or at least to the well-being space. What was it that was the original sort of impetus for that move?
I think you kind of learn what your values are and what you believe in when you see yourself doing them over time. So I was always attracted to agentic and growth-based approaches of the human, and the meaning-making aspect. So some of the early humanistic work, some of the constructivist work, George Kelly's work on psychology of personal constructs. It's not a well-known approach, but it's very similar to some of the early cognitive therapies in terms that we have personal constructs that we use to make sense of or construct the world. So I was interested in approaches that were active, where the human is being active, and so the old standard behavioural approaches. On one hand, they've got learning at the heart of them, but at the other hand, there's not a lot of the person being active in the early versions of that. That's what I'm getting at. So I was attracted to those approaches, but as I went through clinical psych, there was a couple of insights that came to me, and one was that many of our approaches were, this is psychology, PosPsych 101, that many of our approaches are negatively focused and deficit focused, and that sort of narrative is well known. So certainly that was the case. And so not surprisingly, when I developed the work on what's known as the collaborative recovery model, it had goals and agentic components at its heart. But the other thing that happened, so that was one of the reasons, what I'm saying is I was already moving in that direction before positive psychology per se was coined or promoted more broadly. And many people in positive psychology will say that. They'll say, well, yeah, it's given labels to things I was already valuing and taking it, making it more rigorous. But the other thing that I was learning very quickly through practice as well, and seeing people diagnosed with serious mental illness, particularly schizophrenia, just looking at the environments they were coming from. So the idea that we were going to solve it from a purely individual approach, and of course, social determinants of health, sociologists, some aspects of social psychiatry. This is not a new idea. It's just about what had become popular at the time. So I think both the negative assumption or focus and the individual assumption or focus became an awareness that I didn't necessarily want to keep solely heading in that direction. And so it's not surprising that, like if you look at our paper on systems-informed positive psychology and the broader systems approaches are attractive because they do exactly that. So there was a couple of things there, but if you look at some bridges along the way, if you look at coaching and coaching psychology, that is positive in focus, or it's growth-based, and then positive psychology as well, or broadly, if you combine the two, positive psychology for coaching, positive psychology coaching, or coaching for wellbeing, which we're currently writing a book on. If you look at the heart of the collaborative recovery model, which we were doing as part of the recovery movement in mental health, and you look at our book on wellbeing, recovery and mental health, they're the links, they're the bridges where you had people with, one of my early doctoral students, Retta Andreasen, she wrote the book on psychological recovery, and we did that work and stages of psychological recovery, and people living with serious mental illness or enduring mental illness, whichever term we want to use, repeat hospitalisations, that sort of thing. They're talking about recovery, and then when you actually ask them and the narratives about what it was, a lot of it was what the contemporary literature calls wellbeing. They were calling it recovery because that has a political and identity issue within that context. But if you actually look at the components of it, it was a lot of what we would consider aspects of wellbeing: hope, meaning, positive identity, relationships, those types of things. And that's exactly what our models showed. So I saw this congruence between, well, hey, we have this thing called wellbeing that's being researched, and then we have these very disadvantaged people, be they have a diagnosis of schizophrenia or other many different polydiagnoses, from very disadvantaged backgrounds, many of them, or disenfranchised people, but they're also saying that they want well-being, not only symptom reduction. And that was where I saw the real interface between what we were doing with mental health recovery and the sort of work you're doing with complete mental health or bivariate or two dimensions of wellbeing. It's really topical and really relevant, but you were hearing it in the narratives of people, you know, who had a list of diagnoses.
Yeah.
So that was part of the bridge, and so the positive psychology and wellbeing, that was just a scientific way of articulating more of that.
Mm-hmm.
However, the interesting thing in the debates I always used to, or still get into, was both with coaching approaches. Some people wish to define them by the population that they're relevant for.
Yeah.
So, well, coaching is for people without mental illness, and clinical psychology is for people with mental illness.
Gotcha.
Draw a line in the sand and it's neat and tidy, which is fine for legal and regulatory bodies that need that. But really, we all have higher and lower states of psychological functioning at times, and which is why I rejected that idea outright, and we have used positive psychology approaches.
You rejected the idea of the distinction?
Yes.
Between, yeah.
Yeah. And so we got work we were doing, I can look at it right over here, Flourish, a recovery-based self-development program, dated 2008.
Yeah.
So...
which is seriously early.
Yeah, so... And the work with the collaborative recovery model that we were doing was very much in that direction, and it's not a Pollyanna-ish. It's not saying it's going to. The recovery debate was really interesting because it was the co-option of the term as we will me as a person living with a mental illness, I will define what recovery is.
Mm-hmm.
I won't have it given to me.
Mm-hmm.
I won't have my goals and my outcomes given to me by the profession. So there was that. So again, there's that sociology, medicine, or the political kind of aspect, the power aspects of who defines what, not just what illness is, but what wellness or well-being is. So I was attracted to those approaches because again, they're agentic. The person is saying, what is meaningful to me? What am I growing towards? So that kind of values piece, I guess, drives through positive psych and derived from aspects of humanistic or growth-based approaches. So that was the bridge, whether it manifests as goals, positive psychology, coaching psychology, humanistic psychology. Pick your group, but if you go to the underlying values or assumptions about humans, that will be the common factor.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, the arbitrary boxes and poor use of language or conflicting use of language, that's really been a theme, I think, across most of the episodes of this podcast so far. So I'm fully with you. I think even some of what you're talking about, I've heard referred to as, personal recovery.
Mm-hmm.
That distinction between clinical or personal recovery. And so what do you think, it's you just covered a lot there, I guess. When it comes to this idea of, I'm wondering what was the reception of those ideas. Hey, it's in 2008, which is pretty early as far as, I guess, the sort of the formal positive psychology world exists. How was the reception to embedding some of those well-being ideas or agentic ideas into that clinical space?
It really depends on who and where.
Yeah.
The general reception from the people living with mental illness, patients, consumers, users, participants, whichever term that gets used. So the people with that life and that experience, once they understood it, they were really positive.
Mm-hmm.
The allied health people were quite receptive. Nursing staff varied because a lot of nursing staff have so much to do and they have to be very task oriented. So
personal, and then that idea of personal recovery means, like, I guess, more work, less.
Yeah, and the broader aspect to it politically was, which wasn't just about personal recovery, it was about the user or the consumer movement. It was, well, if the consumer is the expert, why do you need professionals? So there was literally that kind of pushback, which wasn't just the recovery or the positive angle. It was the idea that there was this legitimate knowledge or expertise from having lived experience. That's always been a challenge. So much so that I remember once when we were doing some consulting into a large mental health unit in Canada, the unions got called. So
Really?
yeah. So so it's what I call politics of wellbeing. Remember, professions are inherently conservative organisations. They're designed to keep themselves alive. If we had a really rational approach to mental health, we wouldn't have all of these divisions. They're historical fiefdoms that protect themselves. They're not necessarily the most rational, effective or efficient way to provide services.
Yeah, that's a frightening idea, because it means people interested in reform have a seriously uphill battle, I guess, when that's the way that it's phrased.
And that's just a commentary. It's not that everything is terrible.
No, of course not.
It's more just a historical reflection of how things form. I could say similar things about other systems like the school education system or whatever. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. Because I guess that's been our experience, is that, when we were talking, I think in the early days of our work, when it was very sort of talking about the dual continuum model, when we were very much just focusing about that positive continuum, it really didn't resonate, I think, in clinical cohorts, but particularly in workforces. I think as soon as we started having that language of talking now about the integration of the positive and the I don't mean positive and negative, but distress and well-being, let's say, then it was starting to resonate. I think what we see now is that most clinicians that we come across, they actually see themselves working as if that were true. It's just that none of the structures around them support it. Is that kind of in line with your experience?
Yeah, no, totally. So the structural aspects, which is probably the third part to what I wanted to say when you were asking me about my career and how it evolved.
Yep.
Is really thinking about, well, not only do we not just focus on the negative end and that aspect of things. Not only do we not just focus at the individual, but more at the group, but the sheer structural and organisational issues that happen in large human systems, really relevant and really challenging. And we see it time and time again. We see it classically. We see it in a lot of our helping professions when people go on placements or interns. I remember having conversations with many medical students. It's like, oh, you're teaching me about resilience, but then you go and send me off to do my internship with people who have very traditional ideas. So that classic case of, well, if you're not changing the system, it makes it really hard. And one way of thinking about that is, if the individual in some ways is the weakest, the lowest form of the system, it's the weakest part, which is contrary to the
interesting
sort of punch the air liberalism that you might see in North America, that the individual can do anything. And again, those either-or discussions become somewhat painful, which is interestingly part of what's driven my interest in thrivability theory, which focuses on interaction between person and environment.
Yes, great. And just while the dual continuum, we're sort of still talking about that, there was an article that I disagreed with, and I wrote a commentary on it. It was published in the Journal of Pos Psych, and they kind of said, here's a data set where we found that the data looks quite bipolar. So well-being is looking like it's at the opposite end of the spectrum with distress, but really with depressive symptoms. and that's fine, obviously, if that's what the data shows, and that's what the data shows. But what I rejected about the article was that it made the claim that the bipolar model is basically as productive for the future of positive psychology as the bivariate or the dual continuum model. And that was a bit that I really took issue with, specifically for the group that you've mentioned, for those with, chronic mental health challenges or persistent, or as you said, however we'd like to phrase it. The bipolar model is basically a sentence. If clinical recovery is not available to you for whatever reason, then you've removed the opportunity for hope of personal recovery. Is that something that you would agree with, or do you?
Yeah, no,
have I missed the mark?
No, totally agree with the sentiment of what you're talking about in terms. One of the challenges, I think, in some of these discussions is the issue of time or temporality.
Yep.
And staying with a sort of clinical context in mental health, the old distinction of chronic and acute is quite relevant, because paranoid schizophrenia, as it used to be called, it probably is, the different labels that come and go, but many folks who are diagnosed with that may have significant periods of reasonably high levels of functioning, similar to aspects of bipolar disorder. And there's probably a bunch of very recent research which is arguing with what I just said, but I'm just talking in fairly general terms here. And so the issue of time or illness or life course or recovery course is very relevant. So I'll be interested to see more studies in the with the dual continuum or bivariate approach, which take the issue of time more seriously. Because that allows you to have discussions of both, which is actually more consistent with the lived experience of people. They have symptoms that come and go, hopefully go, but don't always. But they still have meaningful lives and they still experience wellbeing, which is obviously very consistent with the bivariate approach. But that's also consistent with their lived experience.
Exactly.
And the clinician's illusion is, you see people when they have symptoms. So that's the part
that's
of
interesting,
the
actually,
existence.
the illusion. Yeah, that's interesting. I'd realised now also that was an extremely leading question that I just asked you. I kind of gave you the answer and said, how much of that do you agree? Yeah.
But I'm adding the issue of temporality, because I think some of the discussions, we get very rigorous about, that's cross-sectional or that's longitudinal.
Yeah. So
in that regard, let's hear more about the longitudinal aspects of the bivariate approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And a dream study of my PhD, it was supposed to be the last study, but I wasn't able to get it done, basically, was, as you mentioned, the lived experience. I was going to do some phenomenological interviewing of people, because basically when we measure, well-being and distress, you kind of see this 10% group of people who are reporting high levels of well-being and high levels of distress. And it was that group of people that I really wanted to understand, because the idea is that they shouldn't exist or they can't exist in a bipolar model. You can't be -8 and +8 on the same continuum. And the joke, it's not really a joke, it's not that funny, but the joke was I actually couldn't find them. So I tried to recruit this group of people and I just couldn't find them. They just never, no one really responded to me. So it's kind of I don't know if it's even that funny, but the idea was I was there to sort of prove that they exist, and when I looked for them, no one replied to my emails. But that was kind of like at a post-COVID time, so that was a bit of a challenging moment. But I think that I'm completely with you, and I think we heard from Chiara Ruini, who talks, who obviously researches wellbeing therapy with Professor Fava, and I think they've gone a long way down that road where they have this combination, obviously, of CBT sort of therapy combined with wellbeing therapy, where they are there obviously first, so like almost in that temporal space that you're talking about, they are addressing acute issues as they show up. But after 3 or 4 sessions, if they think they can sort of remediate that acuteness, they then sort of shift the focus onto the well-being and the recovery. So I think that sounds like a sort of a concrete example of what you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, one of the challenges is, the whole previous systems, health systems, which grew out of the military, patching people up, they got splattered. Putting it very bluntly, but there's a lot of evidence that a lot of the health systems did grow out of the military. Acute.
Yeah, exactly.
And lay conception. I still remember my old health psychology lectures, and the lay conceptions of health come from people's experiences of the common cold. And the assumption, so the assumption is it will go. So our conceptions of chronic conditions or episodic symptoms are not as well developed, and so structures of systems have evolved, and people's conceptions relate to that. Yeah.
Interesting. Wow, that's cool. I hadn't heard that before. Perfect. So, I mean, sort of shifting direction, I guess I had a sort of a general question. I think we've covered it really, but in terms of just to give the opportunity to cover off anything that I haven't asked around, what is it that you think you brought from clinical psychology then to positive psychology? I think we've covered a fair bit of that. But is there anything else that we haven't, that was in your mind that you didn't get a chance to say?
I think rigor. There's a lot of, in terms of the sciences behind clinical psychology and the training, there's a lot of rigor if you do it well, that you bring to question in that sort of middle area between in the applied area but still in the empirical paradigm. I think that is helpful. And excuse me.
That's okay.
Someone's trying to ring me to sell me something, probably. So yeah, that I'll just leave it at that. The rigor piece,
Sure.
as I said, the empirical paradigm in an applied context can be very helpful. It's not the only way of knowing, but it is one really helpful way of knowing.
Great. All right, cool. So we can sort of shift on to another sort of direction I sort of outlined. In terms of, so you were the director of the Centre for Wellbeing Science at the University of Melbourne for a number of years. I'm sorry, I haven't gone back and done the homework.
About 6.5 years. Yeah.
6.5 years. And I guess under your sort of stewardship, I don't know really how the mechanics of it all works. That I noticed that from afar that it changed from the Centre for Positive Psychology to the Centre of Wellbeing Science. And I wondered just generally, where did that come from? And I think I know the answer to these things, but it'd be good to hear from you.
Probably put simply, so the Centre for Positive Psychology, we're in the Faculty of Education, basically, or Melbourne Graduate School of Education. It's a faculty of education, and soon will be literally called that. So we were a group of people perceived as psychology within a broader faculty of education. So that's the context within a comprehensive university. But strategically, I was quite aware that if we keep only being perceived as one discipline, psychology, that we were foregoing opportunities of the multidisciplinary aspect of wellbeing. So it was really just repositioning us into that multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary space around research on wellbeing and its applications. So we're keeping the positive psychology angle, that's one dimension, and then trying to add new ones. So that's largely the reason.
Yeah, no, great answer. And it, obviously marries to the research and the output that your team's producing, isn't it? It's that it's not just psychology published in psychology. You've got all these different disciplines sort of operating as well.
Yeah, and it's very interesting. People don't realise how many disciplines that do have a stake or are interested in this. Some people think aspects of medicine, philosophy, economics, human geography, sociology, and I could keep going, because well-being is ubiquitous. It's part of the human experience. And it's a great shock to some psychologists to realise that there are other people out there that do this.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we were saying before, that is part of the reason of wanting to do the podcast is, I guess from my perspective, wanting to learn and hear from these various disciplines that are out there, and so far so good. I guess it's been a great opportunity. I've got a feeling, I was going to actually calculate this, but I think I've received like 3 book recommendations per episode or something on average. I'm not going to be able to keep up with that, but I definitely have a lifetime's worth of reading up my sleeve now, considering this is a weekly show. As you mentioned, I guess the team is in the department. Did you say the Department of Education, or is it a College of Education?
Faculty.
Faculty. Sorry, yeah. So your team has had this huge focus on positive education, I think. But what I'd love to hear from you, I guess, is this move around wellbeing literacy. It would be great just to give a bit of a context of, sort of where do you think positive education has been, but also then where is it going, and how is your experiences in positive education sort of taken you to wellbeing literacy?
Okay. Couple of points. So positive education, and again, different people will define that differently. Some people talk about it as the science of positive psychology applied in the education context. But if you sit in a building with lots of education experts, which is what I'm literally doing right now, education is a rich discipline with a history. So I'd rather think of positive education as a sort of almost an interdisciplinary intersection between aspects of positive psychology and aspects of education. So in my view, one of the strengths of positive education is that it seeks to articulate in a fairly detailed way what it actually is, what its protocol is. I mean, yes, some people use it loosely, but it can be used in quite a tight way, and this is an intervention. So if we take positive psychology interventions, as they get called, PPIs, the interesting thing is when you come into education, educators will say, well, teaching is an intervention.
Yeah.
So they don't interventionize everything into a package because they're already teaching. So those sort of discourses are really interesting. But positive education is not as well known as people may like to believe. It's very popular in Australia. There are pockets of it in other places, but it's not worldwide. It's not a really well-known enterprise. And I know that from the work I've been doing with the UNESCO International Science and Evidence-Based Education Assessment. SEL, or Social Emotional Learning, is a much better known worldwide set of skills or approaches than positive education per se.
Yep, standing for social and emotional learning.
Yes, social emotional learning. Yeah. So, so positive education is a great thing. Maybe one of the things people forget is the moral education underpinnings or parts to it, given that virtue strengths are part of the approach. So there are those overlaps. So we've literally headed by Professor Randall Curran, who's at the University of Rochester. We've just written a manuscript on an attempt at a consensus definition of wellbeing education.
Great.
And it explores positive education, social and emotional learning, self-determination theory, aspects of moral education or Aristotelian approaches. And if we're going to live well, or in an eudaimonic sense, an ethical sense, who defines the ethics? Does Aristotle define the ethics, or do we have some choice over our ethics, a more liberal approach? So all of those, and so what for education systems? They're very interesting, rich discussions. And if you add that to the sort of UNESCO work, when you talk about 190 odd nation states and you're trying to influence education systems, which of course, when you have that many countries, just think of the different religions and
value systems.
So when you're trying to define what a good life is, then there's a lot of debate. If you want to get to people's core values, ask them about what they'd like their children to be taught.
Yeah.
And it's a very rapid way to get to people's value systems. So it's a lot more contentious than people may realise.
Oh, I've got a feeling that's getting extremely contentious at the moment. I don't think we have to touch on that too much, but look, very interesting. I wonder, two things have come to mind. I guess I'd love for a bit of a caricature of what positive education looks like done poorly versus what it looks like done well. I think that would be really interesting to hear from you. But secondly, I wonder just, my experience of a lot of researchers is the frustration that comes from really knowing something extremely well, seeing almost the opposite applied in the real world. And I wonder how does it feel to be contacted by someone like UNESCO and say, here's an invitation to come and consult. I don't know exactly how it works, but to consult on this thing and give your expertise to change 190 UNESCO nations. How does that feel?
It's never direct.
Okay.
So what I mean by that is systems and human systems will do things, if you can make small changes. By the way, it's one of my reasons I'm so interested in language. If you can make small changes in the way people language something, then you've at least got a chance in maybe changing how they think or behave about something. So it feels good in one sense, but all what it does is create. It reminds you of the enormity of the challenges that await us in terms of education, for example. Mm-hmm. So one of the things we did with UNESCO, we were asked, what is human flourishing, what is education, what is the relationship between the two? And many people from disadvantaged nations, they would look at something like positive education and say, well, that's fine, but they've got to get education first.
Yeah.
If a girl's not allowed to go to school, positive education doesn't have as much relevance, and that doesn't make it a bad thing. But what I'm saying is the relationship between education and well-being is really important before you even start talking about the specifics of the aspects of well-being education. And again, it doesn't undermine it. It's just saying they are really interesting comparisons across nations. At the heart of PosEd is an assumption of agency.
Yep.
That a child, for example, can learn about their well-being and the well-being of others and do something with it and learn some psychological skills, which I fundamentally think is excellent. And if we can distribute the learning of psychological skills across an education system, we may have a different way of thinking about health and well-being, rather than building health services in particular places when we have budgets to do it. So remember what a school education system is. It's the largest captured, and I use captured in hyphens, population. So universal interventions, that is the context for them. So what I'm saying is very much the idea of agency and people learning skills to take some responsibility for their own psychological management is, in my view, a good thing. There's a lot of sociologists that will critique that, and there are. But that's good, and positive education is one part, or one example of a suite of approaches that are looking at that. Sorry, just going back to your former question, what does PosEd look like when it's done poorly?
Yeah.
Probably a teacher coming in and doing a very technical coverage of strengths and then telling people they should be happy, that would be very poorly. I haven't actually seen a teacher do that.
No, yeah.
But that would be the worst version.
No, I can imagine, yeah. And my wife's a primary school teacher, and I get this sense that, you know, people kind of have this reaction, I think, when they say, like, oh, I've heard of an idea, that sounds really valuable, they should be teaching that in schools. And I think it's the perpetual sort of frustration of teachers of, like, we're actually doing this already.
Yeah, if you go on social media, you should be able to find one of those comments within about a minute.
Okay.
Why don't they teach this at school?
Yes,
well,
exactly.
Actually, they do. They just didn't when you went to school.
Yeah, exactly.
Also, in the Australian context, we have some very strong curricula in this area. It needs more work, but it's pretty good. It's more about enabling the systems to do it, which is a different which this is one example of that broader system challenge. So to round that out, what it would look like when it was done well, you'd have a multifaceted, skilled workforce. You'd be treating the school as a system, a community, part of a community. Teacher, parent, student would all have skills and languages around this. And that, I mean, they talk about whole of school, but I'd probably go whole of system, which links back to some of the assumptions of wellbeing literacy, which I imagine we'll come to at some stage.
Yeah, no, look, that's exactly where I would love to go now. So, I mean, just for a bit of context, having read a few of your papers, maybe all of your papers on wellbeing literacy, I'm hearing the origins of where it's come from, I guess, over your career as we're talking. So these ideas of you know, all the way back from the clinical and recovery work that you were talking about, this idea of agency, this idea of almost freedom, of language, the importance of language, and of developing things that are, you know, ubiquitous, I guess. I'm not sure where to start really when it comes to wellbeing. So maybe let's hear your definition of wellbeing literacy.
Okay, well let's start. Yeah, so let's talk about what is wellbeing literacy, and there are different ways of doing definitions, of course. So, starting at the basics, I mean, the shorthand I use is how we communicate about and for wellbeing, and then there are longer definitions. So, and I'll sort of build it out. The fundamental idea is that if we think about wellbeing as a language and as a language learning process, then we can draw from literacy learning and or almost think about it as a foreign language. And that might sound far-fetched, but if you look at the studies on positive and negative words, we have across professions as well, across disciplines, we have more vocabulary for negative things, negatively valenced words and vocab, disease and distress. We have more vocab
compared to good things, to positively valenced.
Compared to good things and well-being. So there is. It might sound like a far-fetched analogy, but it actually.
No, I love it. Yeah.
It actually isn't. So the idea of literacy. And again, I could walk downstairs and there'll be some literacy researchers that will point out the imperfections of my work, such as academic life. But it's how we use. So you say literacy, people hear language or they hear vocabulary, but literacy is the use of language to achieve things. So at the heart of that, there is agency. So if a person has more language and knows how to use it, they have more choices. And if we also accept that language can influence thought, which is an age-old debate going back to Vygotsky and Wolffian hypothesis, how much does language impact on thought? How much does language create reality? So in the social and psychological world, I would argue that it can create reality quite a bit. And if you don't believe me, then think about marketing, or if you don't believe me, why do we use metaphors or analogies all the time to understand psychology? butterflies in the tummy to describe anxiety. All of Freud's work is based on a hydraulic steam metaphor. Cognitive science is based on the analogy of our mind as a computer. So we have root metaphors to most of what we think of psychologically. So the role of language in shaping thought in the psychological realm and social realm is quite arguably there. Philosophers of language will debate that. But if you accept what I just said,
Yep.
then the lever to use language for people to impact on people's well-being is quite large.
Yeah, and almost this is, maybe tell me if this is a really bad example, but I'm really conscious of making this as concrete as possible. Imagine I only know the words good and bad, and I have a work day where I have highs and lows, bad emails and a paper gets published or something. Then I come home and my wife says, "How was your day?" I really only have the ability to communicate it was a good day or it was a bad day. Whereas if I had more language, I'd be able to say, basically I had highs and lows. Is that too simplistic? Like, am I missing the mark there?
So if you think about if you get some more words, you've got more concepts to describe.
Yes, exactly.
Or describe your experience or construct your experience.
Yes, and that's personally and how you construct it for yourself and how you then communicate that to others. Which
is why you're attracted to to bivariate approaches rather than univariate, because it's giving you more options.
Yeah.
than good and bad. But so the complexity so the real aspect of that from my perspective in a wellbeing piece is the agency that it brings as well.
Yes.
So you could argue that literacy learning does that in general, but with what we've done with wellbeing literacy is we've developed the capability model of wellbeing literacy. So if you think about this from left to right, we start with the first part is vocabulary and knowledge, which is the pretty much standard or denotive. So a word denotes something. This is a table. So that very concrete starting point. And then the second and third components of the approach or the model are really comprehending and composing, or language theorists might call it receptive and expressive language use. So comprehending and composing, these kind of go together. So we take communications or information in, composing, we put it out. So we think about the pairs, reading and writing, which is a very common way of thinking about literacy, of course, speaking and listening, or listening and speaking, probably, if I stay in the order. Sometimes I'm getting this jumbled up. Let's go listening and speaking. Yep. And then the final one, viewing and creating. So if it's a bit hard because we're in an auditory domain, but if you draw those three pairs, reading, writing, listening, speaking, viewing and creating, and the ones on the right are all the composing, they're all the stuff going out. So writing, speaking, creating. And creating can be, if you think about visual creation, you might be creating a visual piece of art or a dance or something which people look at. And then the comprehending pieces are reading, something's going in, listening, something hopefully is going in, viewing, something's going in. So that is part of the Australian curriculum literacy learning approach, those three pairs. So we chose that because it's practical and useful, and a lot of academics attacked it because it's imperfect.
Sure.
But it's good enough.
Yeah.
For us to work with. So that's component 2 and 3. So we have vocab and knowledge about wellbeing. We can read and write about it. We can speak and listen about it.
Yep.
But we can create things for people to look at and look at them. One of the things with positive psychology interventions is most of them are writing interventions. There's a lot of reading and writing interventions, and so the multimodal, so those are different modes of communicating. The multimodal approach to language use is a missed opportunity, at least in the way we've approached it. And of course, there's these little things called emojis that get used in texts. You're creating an image, and someone else is viewing it.
That's a great point. Is that I mean, in many ways, it is a new language, isn't it? There are complete.
So this stuff's all around us. It's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. That's why it's such a huge lever to impact and understand well-being. So the fourth and fifth parts are really important. So we have vocab and knowledge. So that's the basic stuff. Then we have the multiple modes of them being sent or received. But language doesn't use itself. Language is not automatic. Language has a user, and that user exists in a context. So that relates to the fourth and fifth components of the capability model of wellbeing literacy, and that is, the fourth one is really sensitivity to context.
Yes.
So the simplest way to understand this is, do you speak to your wife in a different way than you speak to your boss, in a different way than you speak to your child? And the answer is probably yes. And certainly, languages, particularly the Latin languages, they have feminine and masculine built into them. And obviously, gender equity people may not like that, but it does. And so it's another example of how do we adapt our language use for context. So that's a skill or a capability. The ability to do that gives you more choices, and gives you more choices to co-create or co-construct aspects relating to well-being. Another part of the model, and I'll come to the fifth component in one moment, but it's communicating about and for well-being. Because I can use well-being related words, but do them in a very nasty way and make you feel terrible. So there's both the aboutness, which is a word in philosophy of mind, that is, ideas they denote or refer to something, but then there's our intention. What are we trying to do? We're trying to do it in a way which, when you talk to someone in a way to not hurt their feelings, that's what I'm talking about. And it's not just talking, of course. There are other domains. So there's that component, and then the final component, the last component is what's intentionality, which is this idea of having the intentions but developing the intentions so that it becomes a habit of mind. And some of the traditions where you think about some of the mindfulness and meditation approaches, they're trying to develop habits of mind. And another definition of wellbeing literacy that sometimes gets used is mindful use of language, which is really referring to that aspect of it. Watching your P's and Q's. There are many, many examples of this. It's a very ubiquitous idea. So the capability model just helps us be more conscious of each of these different elements. And I would argue, if you go to people talking about positive education, for example, or social emotional learning, and you go to a conference and you look at all the booths, I would argue, well, they're all selling you different language sets. They're not selling you programs, they're selling you different language sets of vocabs and how to communicate about these areas. So it kind of sits above programs. It's more of a general capability.
Definitely. That's a nice tie-in, I guess. A while ago, we don't work in this space really anymore, but when we did have a youth sort of resilience program where we were working across different youth agencies with their staff, I think the evaluation really showed that the program, it was a programmatized kind of setup, but what was so key was having a majority of staff go through this program, which the end result and the powerful result was a consistent use of language, and basically a shared language now around these things that, almost going back to where we began when you said, I'm a clinical psychologist, but I was hearing things or the experience of people from PosPsych saying, with the introduction of pos psych, I'm actually hearing things that I believed already. It's giving me the language that I kind of already knew.
Mm-hmm. And so that relates to a couple of things. The issue of identity, the idea of language use and narrative, is very much identity forming. I remember sometimes the old scientist practitioner model that was part of clinical psychology training. I remember one of my former supervisors, Professor Ian John, referred to that as a socially agreed way that we must talk about our practice so that we can join the club of clinical psychology. So this idea of the role of language use to form our narratives, narratives to form our identity, quite important. The other part of this, which is very relevant, different communities have there are different language communities.
Yes.
And so the idea of lay concepts of well-being. And Wittgenstein said, the meaning of a word can change by the context in which it's used.
Yeah.
So people say, what's your definition of well-being? Because they want one definition so they can do scientific studies that relate to that particular paradigm. One of the assumptions of wellbeing literacy is you can ask different communities what their vocabs of wellbeing are, and do it in that way. So it's very much trying to promote the multiple languages, multiple communities approach. The people who want an objective single definition will get perturbed by that. You can still do that, but you just got to say who owns it.
Yeah, and is it not the case, I guess, that basically if you are trying, you can define it in a single phrase, but if you do so, it's going to be so broad and all-inclusive that it essentially becomes meaningless anyway.
And the real magic is asking, and what people may give you in a definition may not actually be consistent with their actual behaviour of what language they use in the world. So those things are actually they're actually interesting research questions as well. But it's
absolutely.
Dynamic, it's contextual, but the reason it's a capability model is that each of them, you can learn more vocab and knowledge. You can learn better ways to visually create and visually view, read, write. You can learn better ways to adapt to context, and you can learn how to train yourself to use language intentionally well. So they're all, and if you can do those things, you are more capable, and you have more choices to construct your well-being through language. And the other part of this is language is inherently relational, and relationships are the most robust predictor of well-being. So as a lever, I would argue it's a really big lever for us to think about these approaches.
Yes. Okay. I'm with you completely. I'm a fan, obviously, of the model. One concern that I have for the model has nothing to do with the model. It has to do with what we've sort of been speaking about a little bit already, which is how is it misunderstood, and clearly it's a complicated model. I think more complicated than the sort of the simplistic things that you would generally see out there. It's kind of philosophical. It's confusing to talk about language. Is that a concern of yours, or how do you see this moving forward in a way of being adopted? Like, I guess my fear is that if it is complicated, it's obviously, I think it's tending towards being extremely useful, but if it's too complicated that it wouldn't be adopted?
I think it's a matter of how it's communicated, or who picks it up, and how it's worked with in context. So I've tracked you through the formal model, meaning relevant to all contexts.
Yep.
So and we already have different people working in different contexts. So I have one of my doctoral students, Lisa Baker, is working with the model with early childhood people. We have other people working with it in organisational contexts. So it would look and need to look quite different, its use and introduction in different contexts. But that's entirely consistent with what I was saying about language communities. How you might use it in early childhood is different than secondary, different than primary, different than tertiary education, how it's used in the workplace. So it would become more tangible if people use it within the context. So, what vocab and knowledge do we have? How do we do it here? So it's situated. And so if it's done in that regard, I'm not too concerned about it. We don't need to turn everyone into a philosopher of language or philosopher of mind if we start talking about intentionality. That's not needed. That's the formal model which drives the underpinnings. So it's kind of a meeting of the formal model with context, and then ask the people.
I'm with you. I wonder if is there a tangible example from one of those, from the experiences of one of your students that are working on this?
We've got several. Like we've done, Dr. Jackie Francis has been working in with Richmond Fellowship Queensland. So I've been using this in the workplace with people similar, going right back to our early part of this conversation, community mental health context with the workers there, and actually asking them how they define and construe and talk about wellbeing, and the different ways they communicate it, and etc. So actually working directly with them and then asking them, and then that co-design or co-building approach. And similarly, more recently, been working with Indigenous communities in Queensland, looking at their language and meanings around wellbeing, and how they communicate about it and the way they do it. But still always keeping the formal model as a guide, but then working with that, with the people. And that's the difference between an implemented packaged model and a co-design model, and it's the beauty of having a formal model with the recognition of adaptation to context.
I just wonder, this is a really more of a passing comment, but if you're sort of thinking of wellbeing literacy as a foreign language in a sense, in the sense that there might be communities that don't really have this capability, or I mean, maybe you would reject even that presupposition, but the idea that we might go to a particular group that may not have this language, how does co-design sort of bring that out?
That's a good question. I mean, you can still teach people. Well, you can say, well, in this culture they have this, and Dr. Tim Lomas's work on untranslatable words or idiosyncratic words. Dr. Lanchi Huang, who's a former doctoral student with me, was looking at Chinese international students' conceptualizations of well-being. So you actually have conversations about other cultures, and this is how they view it, and ask them, do you have anything similar? Obviously you need some common language to be able to ask them, or interpreters or whatever. But if you take the adage that all learning is intercultural, which one of my colleagues, Professor Yusuf Waghi, who works out of southern parts of Africa, and taking the idea of learning was when tribes met each other, and so all learning is intercultural.
Interesting.
So it's not that you're trying to convert them to your point of view. It's saying, well, hey, there are other points of view. What do you think? So that kind of model. And if you look at some of the contemporary views of literacy learning, plurilingualism rather than bilingualism, the idea that language is a resource that we have parts of and we use bits and pieces from everywhere, which is actually a fairly contemporary view of literacy learning. If we take it in that kind of model, then there's not really, I don't really see a problem. They might say, no, we don't have that, but we have this. And then away you go.
I guess I was probably thinking of like this hypothetical but maybe non-existent population where say you're doing the co-design and they aren't able to recall how they express well-being. That's almost what I was thinking. If they're but I guess, are you sort of saying that just doesn't exist?
I think it's a negotiation of meanings that naturally happens in conversations or dialogues, or you call it this, we call it that. that's actually the magic of it. It's
Okay.
quite wonderful.
Yeah. Okay. Great. All right. Perfect. And then and then the future of wellbeing literacy. So where do you hope to see it go?
I think, like, if we look at where it came from, it one of the things I remember when I was doing some consulting for some non-government organisations, particularly around wellbeing, and also for governments and the government departments, it's like, well, correctional services call it this, and education's calling it this, and health's calling it this, and we all use it in different ways. And that was where we developed some language guides, and then we realised, well, language guides are only as good as what about asking the people how they use it, rather than trying to impose a single language, which never works because language is dynamic. They talk about the dictionary being one of the great adages of conservatism because it tries to hold the meaning of something constant. So
People get upset when like LOL gets added or something.
So in terms of where it can go, I would. We're seeing it being used in different ways by state departments within Australia. Like South Australia's already used the measure of it once. Some conversations with New South Wales Department of Education and Training. People are attracted to it. I think where we need to go is exactly what we were just talking about, having more examples of actual contextual uses of the model.
Yes. Yeah.
We also want to get better at measuring it. We have one measure known as the WellLit 6, which is a brief self-report, but that doesn't really capture the magic of the approach. It's a very standard self-report.
Can it be measured, do you think, in a quantitative way?
I believe aspects of it can.
Okay.
One of the challenges of psychologists like to measure abilities and behave as though the thing is the characteristic of the individual. As soon as in my view, if you use the term capability, you're including the environment, which makes it more second order, makes it more of a challenge. So I think, yes, we can have meaningful indices to aspects of this, and particularly if we see it in a learning context, we can measure people's increase in vocab and knowledge. We can measure multimodality. So, can we measure literacy is a question in general. So I think we can do aspects of this, but also why, and asking practitioners, be they teachers or health people or people in organisations or parents or husbands and wives, because you have a wellbeing literacy community in your own marriage. So I think the practical use of it, seeing people play with, use, critique, adapt the model is where to next, and which we're doing a bit of, but we'd like to obviously do it at a bigger scale.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you, Lindsay. I guess this almost leads into where you were going. I just wanted to say it basically as a comment. One of the exciting things that I often see in the sort of like in the social media lives of these wellbeing experts that I am connected with is how I can see it, I think, from afar, how this applies to the lives of their kids. And I can definitely see that, I think, coming through sort of your experience. You've got boys that seem to be sort of flourishing, so that's really exciting, I guess. It gives me hope for my kids applying this extremely valuable work.
There are certain times of the day you could come by our place and you may not believe what you just said.
Okay. No, that's cool. And I guess, anyway, that's just a side note. My last question is really a very silly question. So before we go into that, is there anything you wanted to cover that we didn't get to just yet?
Just very briefly, some of the work, I'm not going to open it up, but just build the link. So I was just talking about wellbeing literacy as a capability approach. That is something people can do in their language environment, which gives them more choices. So that general principle is very similar to the broader thrivability theory that I'm working towards. That is, a person has certain abilities and then they interact with an environment which has certain affordances, and that can be a useful way of thinking about wellbeing and flourishing. So are just drawing the link between some of the assumptions underpinning wellbeing literacy are also the same assumptions that underpin thrivability theory.
Yeah, and my apologies. I actually made a mental note, but I forgot to say it out loud, which was that I didn't go into thrivability because I thought, we'll wait for it to be sort of formally published. But I think there's a really good lecture on YouTube, as I understand, that I can link to.
Yeah, it's very old though.
Okay, so you wouldn't recommend going there?
Not really.
Okay, is there a place people can find for something a little bit more up to date?
Not quite. Not as a YouTube version.
Okay.
There's bits and bobs on the internet, but basically I just leave listeners with the idea that if we take the idea of thrifa, which is the etymology of thriving, and the assumption that thriving and flourishing and well-being are not the same thing, and if we get serious about thinking about the interaction of person and environment, that's a hint to where thrivability goes. And so yes, we can develop aspects of the person. Yes, we can change aspects of the environment. How do we look at the interaction between the two? Taking that as your fundamental idea and then thinking about wellbeing through that lens, that's leading into sort of some of the core parts of thrivability theory. Yeah.
Great. And okay, so now you've just given me two dumb questions to end this with, but the less silly one, I guess, is just almost from a logistical. You're an extremely busy person, I assume.
No, I just sit around and enjoy myself.
Well, it's like you are so well read. Like you're talking about etymology, and that's not a common thing that people are sort of telling me about. You've clearly gone into depth around literacy and philosophy around these sorts of concepts. Where are you how do you find the time? Like, are you reading all the time? How does it kind of work?
Etymology, there's kind of, not to be confused with entomology, which is about insects. So etymology to me, I just get fascinated by where words come from.
Yep.
So when I see a word, I'll look it up. And that's called like Google or some other search engine that you may choose to use. Okay. And you can do that on your phone. So that's more of a in real life kind of thing.
Okay.
So that I don't know about that example. I think what happens too is when reading is one way of knowing, but when you meet a lot of people, you just talk to them like we've just been talking about ideas.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's in positive psych, it probably gets called curious. So if you genuinely see everything as learning, that's when it's a bit like incidental exercise. It's not like planned study.
Nice.
You're just learning as much as you can wherever you are.
That's really useful, actually, so I don't have to feel too guilty about that ever-growing book list that I'm not ever getting to.
Well, no, I had a problem with books once, and so what I do, that is I used to buy too many and then they just sat there. So what I do now is I take a photo of the cover, and then that's sort of proxy for the purchase, and then if it still lingers a week later when I'm looking at my phone, then I might go back and get it. So
cool.
That's my anti-addiction intervention.
Nice one. Yeah, nice one. I bought a Kindle almost for that reason. And I do like reading off the Kindle, but I just don't want... I want my kids to sort of like see me reading books, otherwise I won't know whether I'm just like scrolling social media or reading. But anyway, that's a silly other topic. My last quick question is, and I'm conscious of your time, sorry about that. Napoli, you seem to have a affiliation or some affinity to the city of Naples. That's, my family are from the sort of the areas around there. Just give me a quick highlight, or maybe you hate it and I've completely got it wrong.
No, we own a property in Gippsland in Victoria called Campagna of Menion. So I became enamoured with Campagna and have travelled there a couple of times. But the more I got to know about Napoli in particular, there's kind of like this historical argument with the north, or this jostling against the rich north. So I think Napoli gets a bad rap. If you watch
Gomorrah,
crime, or all this, so it isn't as polished as some American tourists may wish it to be. but it's got this incredible rich history, and it's kind of got a shunning of the rich north and the unification. So there's this kind of, it reminds me a little bit of how the north of England treats the south of England. So there's this kind of underdog, we're proud, don't give us your rich Milano version of the world, we're doing it our way. And there's a sort of brashness about Napoli which reminds me of the New Yorkers, but underpinning that brashness is a pride. And this was really exemplified by obviously winning the Serie A Campione d'Italia. So there's this real, it was more than soccer or football, it was we beat the North. So I kind of got curious about that.
Great, yeah, nice. And
did
just
that fit?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And there was so it's from the outside, I think it must be crazy, but people getting tattoos of the Italian flag upside down, with the number 3 to symbolize that this is the third time they've won the Serie A. But it's just like it's almost like they can't celebrate without it being in the context of their rivalry with the rest of the country.
Yeah. Well, too, but again, looking at historically, Kingdom of Naples was half of the boot.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you so much, Lindsay. This has been really, really educational. And,
what was your highlight, Matt? I like asking people what of our meeting. I like asking people what
this
highlights
conversation.
Of meetings are. I'm hoping there was one.
Nice. There definitely was one. I think the highlight was, being the luxury of being walked through the literacy model. To be honest with you, I think that's probably 2 that I would say off the top of my head. The luxury of walking through the model, like obviously reading the paper, I think it comes alive when you hear the author explaining it to you, and you can ask some questions just to make sure that your head's in the right spot. Second, I think is, which I get from every conversation, is the nuance, the grey areas between the black and white. Is positive education good or bad? That's kind of how you see it on social media. The grey, the useful grey, I think has been really, really exciting from this conversation.
Yep, there's a lot of useful grey in Melbourne at the moment.
Yeah, it's sunny. It's sunny in Adelaide if you ever feel like coming back.
Will do.
All right. Thanks, Lindsay. Cheers.
All right. Thanks, Matt. Take care.
All right. Please join me in thanking Lindsay for a really great conversation. I'm going to reach out to, I think, a few of the people who are doing Lindsay talked about like focus groups of really getting to concrete examples of what wellbeing literacy looks like in different populations. And I think I'm going to try and reach out to a couple and get some of those examples, because I still, to be honest with you, struggle to get my head around it a little bit. And I think it'll make a lot more sense with a couple of really concrete examples. So thanks for listening. Remember, please subscribe on YouTube this week. That's my one little mission. And I might see you at the conference. Bye.